shared access, that was all good, but apparently it's not, so.
Oh, well, were you like driving to right into the garage? Like.
No. No, this is just a vacant lot, but it's got a shared access. Disputes about who owns it. Yeah.
All right, there's that back for you. Thanks, sir. How's it going? I'm Cody. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
Hey Dave, how are you?
Good.
Good.
The dog property, LLC. Good puzzle.
It's a nice lot.
Just gotta get to it.
Yeah, I mean, I have an easement, but it's like not quite wide enough, I guess, so I have to ask for some more.
Gotcha.
Oh,
Josh,
okay.
involved in that?
They have it right now, yeah.
Yeah.
Or he probably doesn't know, but Caitlin does.
All right, 5:30, let's roll. Okay, Planning Commission Community Advisory Planning Commission meeting, August 17th, 2023, 5:30. Call this meeting to order. Paula, may we please have the roll call?
Here.
Here.
Here. Present. Here. Here.
All right, let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Next is the approval of the agenda. If all the commissioners have reviewed the agenda, may I please have a motion to approve and a second?
I'll make a motion to approve. Second that.
The agenda has been motioned to be approved and seconded. All in favor of approving the agenda, raise your right hand, say aye.
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 It was me.
Yeah. Next is the approval of the minutes from the August 3rd meeting, 2023. If all have reviewed those minutes and approved them, may I please have a motion to approve those with a second?
Motion to approve those minutes.
Second.
Excellent. Thank you. The approval of the minutes has been there has been a motion to approve the minutes from the August 3rd meeting with a second. All in favor of approving those minutes, raise your right hand, say aye.
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 It wasn't there, so I didn't.
Mark Popoff wasn't there. Thank you. Next is the time for public comment. During this portion of the meeting, anyone may speak on any subject that does not later appear on the agenda. 5 minutes per person will be allowed. Is there any public with us at all? Okay, no, we'll move on from that. Next is a discussion item. Josh, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, just briefly, I think I explained kind of why we're here last time around, and I'll just keep it short and hand things over to Matt and his team. Matt and CJ Doxey are with us here tonight from MIG, and I will let them take it away.
All right. Thanks, Josh. So back in front of you on the screen again tonight, I'm going to share a presentation similar to what I did last time. So let me get that up on the screen. All right. Looks like that is showing up there. Yeah, so this is the agenda. We'll just give you kind of an update on where we are in this process, kind of what we've done since we last talked, where we're headed. And then there's sort of two main topics for us to talk about tonight, present you with some information and see if you have questions or comments or suggested changes to what we've done so far. So the first is to talk about comparison of projected need for land for housing with the estimated supply of land for housing. So comparing the two things that I presented information about last time, the buildable lands inventory and the housing projections and the land need associated with those things. So that's the first bit, item 2, and then talk about potential amendments to the housing chapter of your comprehensive plan. And that includes amendments to these 3 parts of that chapter, background information and findings, goals and policies, and implementation actions. And so we'll talk more about that when I get to that, and then we'll just kind of finish up with next steps. And I would say, as before, feel free to interrupt me along the way. I'll kind of pause for questions, at least after each one of those main topic areas. But if you have questions as I'm talking, just go ahead and interrupt me and raise your hand or something. I can see y'all pretty well there. And I'll do my best to answer the questions. Hopefully you had a chance to read the meeting summary we put together of the last meeting, and we did our best to answer some of the questions that I wasn't able to answer during the meeting. So hopefully that was helpful. So I will just start walking through this and see what y'all have to say. So just kind of again, a reminder of the steps in this process. And so the first 2 we talked about last time, in particular, projecting the need for different types of housing over the next 20 years. And at the same time, preparing an inventory of the supply of buildable land within the city's urban growth boundary. Next step then is to compare those 2 things. So that's what we've done. And we described that in an updated draft of the housing needs analysis memo that we sent you in advance of the meeting. So it's kind of the last section of that document. And I'll present kind of just the summary of that tonight on the in the presentation. And then preparing updates to your comprehensive plan. So we've done that as well. And that was part of your packet too. So again, we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then from here, we head towards an adoption process. First, we'll have a work session with the city council, and then hearings with you all and the city council to adopt the recommendations that get taken forward. So that's where we are. This is just, kind of a similar schedule in a different form. So we'll talk about that too much, other than to note that council work session is tentatively scheduled for September and the public hearings for October. So it's a pretty fast moving process from here forward. I've got a couple of slides in here that are repeats from the last presentation, just to kind of remind you of, what we've done here. I didn't repeat too many of them, but this is just kind of a repeat of the buildable land inventory process, where we're starting with all land in the urban growth boundary, or narrowing it down to residential lands that are zoned for residential use, and then classifying land as vacant or partially vacant with the potential for infill or redevelopment, filtering out constrained land that's constrained by natural resources or hazards, to get to net buildable acres. Now, in the tables I'm going to show you, we're actually kind of showing gross buildable acres, because those numbers haven't pulled out land for streets and infrastructure yet, and we're looking at kind of gross capacity. So we've kind of kept it all in that form. So that's just kind of a reminder of that. And then again, the other side, the demand side of the equation, is the projected number of housing needs or housing units needed in the future. Just a reminder of some of the data sources that we use in doing that projection. Kind of the main starting point are those population projections from the Portland State University Population Center and their forecasted growth rates over the next 20 years. And then all this other data informs the projected need for different types of housing and for people in different income levels, different ages, and different household sizes. And that's kind of how we get to the projections of the need for specific types of homes. So this was a summary of the buildable lands inventory. And again, the far right column, buildable acres, that's gross acres. If you add those two rightmost bottom numbers up, you get about 334 acres, and you'll see that in some subsequent slides as well. Just kind of a reminder of what the projections say about the average growth rate over the next 20 years and what that translates to in terms of increase in population and needed housing units. So the average projected annual growth rate over the next 20 years from PSU is 0.3%, so a little under 0.5%. It's not too different from what you've been seeing in terms of kind of building permits over the last 2 or 3 years, but it is lower than the growth rate that the Dow's experienced between 2010 and 2023, assuming an average household size of 2.5 people. And ultimately, what this translates to is about 500 additional housing units over the next 20 years. Because of the low vacancy rate there, we're kind of making up for that to some degree. And so you see more projected housing units than households. So that's kind of why that number is larger. So that's a summary of kind of the two things that go into this comparison. And then also the types of housing units or homes that we're projecting, and kind of the proportions of those in terms of traditional single family detached homes, townhomes, plexes, apartments, and manufactured homes. You see some stats on that on this slide. And so when we compare those two things, this is a summary table that's, again, sort of towards the end of that housing needs analysis report that was in your packet. What we see is an inventory. So I'm going to take a sort of a step back. So we showed you acres at the last meeting, and we did have some translation of acres to units based on what we previously assumed in terms of average densities of development. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute too, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit now. This shows the average sort of projected gross density for different types of zones, the low density, medium density, and high density zones. Gross density, we're assuming about 5.5 units per acre in the low density zone, an average of 12 in your medium density zone, and just under 19 in your high density zone. So when you translate the acres to units applying those densities, it's pretty large capacity in terms of number of units. That's kind of that bottom second number in the bottom row, 3,300 units, quite a bit. And then the new unit projected growth is 505. And so the sort of bottom line is that you have enough land to support that estimated amount of growth. And I would say a couple of things about that. One, we know not all of that land is available for development right now. We know there's constraints on that land. We've already kind of taken out the land that's subject to constraints related to natural resources and hazards, but there are other things that constrain land or make it more expensive to develop. But it's still and we also know that growth could occur faster than what Portland State University has projected over the next 20 years. And so if growth occurs more quickly, if some of that land is not as buildable, is not buildable in the shorter term, you may sort of bump up against a supply issue, but it's a pretty significant surplus based on these numbers, even though these numbers are a set of calculations, pretty technical, but it's a pretty good sized surplus. And the other thing I would just note is that the city's going to be required to update this analysis every 8 years, and those forecasted population growth numbers are going to get updated periodically as well. So think of this as this is sort of the current projection. And it currently is saying you've got enough land in your urban growth boundary to meet 20 years of projected growth, but you're going to go through this process again, and you're not going to wait 20 years to do that. So there will be an opportunity to revisit that. And then I'm just going to say I've got kind of one more slide to talk about this need and supply comparison. Then I'm going to stop and pause and just see if you have any questions or comments. So in terms of those average densities of development that we showed, we looked at kind of a number of things in terms of coming up with those. One, for each of those zones, your low, medium, and high density zones, what do you allow? What's the minimum lot size allowed? What's the minimum density required and the maximum density allowed? What types of housing are projected or expected to be developed in those different zones? What do developers typically do in terms of developing at the min versus the max density they can develop at? And kind of what's the pattern of residential lots in those areas? So ultimately, we landed on some densities that are sort of somewhere in the middle of your minimum and maximum allowed densities. And we tried to kind of reflect these different factors associated with development. So we're not assuming that all of that land is going to get developed at the most dense level it could be under your zoning code. And we're also not assuming that it's going to get developed at the lowest density it could be developed at, given that you've got some minimum density requirements. So I just wanted to kind of note that in terms of how we came up with those numbers. I would call it a little bit of science and a little bit of art. So wanted to talk about that. And I'm going to pause, stop, see if you all have any questions about this piece. It's, I will say, a pretty technical analysis, and there's a lot of state guidelines and requirements around how we go about doing this analysis. But that's not to say we can't make changes if we can kind of document how and why we should be making those changes. So yeah, so I'll stop and just see if you have any comments or questions for us all, and do my best to answer them. If I can't, I might be able to get Brendan Buckley on our team from Johnson Economics to answer some after the meeting as well. So, but CJ and I will do our best.
Would you mind just going back to the previous slide, please?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Let me look at that for a second.
Sure.
Oh, Paula, we're not recording. Now we are. Okay. Okay, so what I'm looking at this graph for is do you see a greater need in one of these zoning types over any of the others, like something that we should be focusing on developing, maybe, or allowing for, or in some way encouraging development over other ones?
Not necessarily, because what you're trying to do is accommodate a full range of different housing types. And what we've shown in terms of the demand is the demand that we estimated for different types of housing, and then how much land it would take, to develop the number of units and the type of units. So in terms of where you see the most demand, even though we're kind of assuming over the next 20 years a somewhat increasing percentage of some attached housing types, townhouses, plexes, et cetera. The majority or more than half of the projected housing units are still expected to be in a single family detached homes. So that's where you see sort of more than half the number of new units. And we're expecting most of those units to be developed in your RL or your low density zone. You've still got a fair bit of capacity in that zone to develop those units. So that's why you're sort of seeing a surplus there. And in the other two zones, you still see a surplus. Your medium density zone allows for a number of things. But it's got kind of the least number of acres in it. But because a fair number of medium density housing types can now be developed in any of those zones, I think that's not as big of an issue, because your code allows duplexes and single family attached homes in the low density zone, and the kind of triplexes, quadplexes make up a smaller percentage, but they can be developed in that higher density zone as well. So I think that because of what your zoning code allows in different zones, there's not, unless development or growth really picks up and is more than what we're projecting here, I don't see, just looking at these numbers don't sort of say that you've got a bigger issue in one zone versus another, or that you should be focusing on developing in one zone. I would say, so this is a long answer to a straightforward question, I think, but I would say, and we talked about this the last time we worked on a housing needs analysis for you, and you've done this to some degree, is that the higher density zone, that's an area where, like, traditionally you've had a lot of lower density housing developed. And so you've got kind of this mix of different housing types that are on the ground in that area, but you established minimum density in that zone that's going to sort of push people towards new housing being higher density, which is what that zone is zoned for. So I think, you've sort of got the tools in place in terms of your zoning ordinance to do that, to be consistent with that policy and with that zoning. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at, or if I answered the question.
Yeah, that answers my question perfectly.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay. Any
Anybody
other questions on this? I know that's a lot of information I threw at you.
No. Okay. Nope. Let's keep rolling.
All right. So the next piece of this I'm going to talk about are the comprehensive plan amendments. I'm going to talk about these at a pretty high level. I'm not planning to go through all the text of the comprehensive plan amendments, but I'm happy to kind of open up the packet and look at any of those specific amendments, particularly to goals and policies, if y'all want to talk about any of those in particular. So I've kind of got the packet open in another window, and we can switch from the presentation to the packet if you want to talk about some specific amendments. But I'll just give you kind of a high level overview of what we've done, and then see if you have any questions or if you want to talk about specific changes. So there's kind of three pieces of the comp plan. There's background information and findings, goals and policies, and then implementation strategies or actions. And we're recommending changes to all those things. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about sort of the nature of the changes. I'm going to go back first. So for the background information and findings, we're essentially suggesting replacing everything in that section of the housing chapter with a new set of narrative that essentially summarizes the information that's in the housing needs analysis report. Because what's in there now is, out of date. It was prepared a while back. And so, we just want to basically give that a refresh and just replace it with a summary of what's in the housing needs analysis. So we took kind of the 30 pages of stuff there and boiled it down to what we felt like was the most kind of salient information of about 5 or 6 pages of narrative and tables and charts and things. So that's kind of what we're doing there. And then in terms of changes to the goals and policies and implementation strategies, there's a number of different types of changes or sort of objectives we've used here to make all those underline and strike through changes you see in the packet in this section. So kind of first and foremost, address what we found in the HNA In terms of the need for a range of housing types, you'll see language that talks about supporting development of a range of housing types. And also, meeting the needs of people in different income ranges, addressing the needs of people who are homeless or at risk of being homeless, policies like that. So that's kind of first and foremost. Incorporating some housing planning best practices. So some of the languages revolves around that, for instance, making sure that you continue to monitor that supply of buildable land and you update that information periodically so okay, what is your remaining supply. There was some information in there that's really outdated. It's just those were the policies at that time, and they were applied to specific areas, and or they related to specific parts of your code that have since been updated. So we are suggesting eliminating stuff that does not seem to be relevant or timely anymore. There are a few places where you had duplicative policy language, not a lot, but a few. So we eliminated some of that. We also, in policies themselves, we try, this is sort of like a comprehensive plan best practice. We try not to have a policy be like an action, like a specific action, go do this one thing, because these are supposed to be long-term policies. And if they're specific actions and you achieve them, then the policy is no longer relevant. So we try to think of policies as a course of action that achieves a goal. So we rewrote or moved some of those specific actions into the implementation strategies and out of the policy language. One of the other sort of best practice things we do in terms of comp plans is we don't want a policy to be so specific that it basically acts as a development code standard, because then you set up a potential conflict with the development code itself. And there weren't too many instances of that, but there were a couple things where you had language in the policies that really applied a specific standard. And so in those cases, we would eliminate those. We added some language just to refer to the supporting policy, supporting documents, the housing needs analysis, et cetera. And then there's a couple policies we added just to kind of incorporate some other community goals and objectives. So I think we added some policy language, for instance, around promoting use of more sustainable building materials and practices, and promoting resilience, to climate changes and things like that. So there's not a ton of those, but there's a few. So those were the types of things that we were trying to do in updating the policies and the implementation strategies and the goals in the comprehensive plan. So there's quite a few changes in there. And again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm happy to, take a look through any one of them or any of them, if you'd like to do that. So, but I wanted to just give you first kind of a high level, here's what we were trying to achieve. And then, see if you want to look through some of those specific things. And then I can kind of switch out of the presentation and put some of those up on the screen if you want to do that. Totally up to you.
Yeah, we can keep moving forward and put those up on the screen.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna temporarily stop sharing here, and then reshare with just the that document. So give me a sec. Now what you should be seeing up there is it says housing goals at the top. And so I still don't, I'm not going to walk through all these, but I've got them up here, and maybe we can just sort of ask you, does anybody have any questions or comments, for instance, on the first section, the housing goals? There's now, well, it says 10, but we eliminated a couple, so I guess 8. And that's the other thing, is we'll have to renumber these in a subsequent draft, because right now we haven't updated the numbering. So it just gets kind of messy in terms of the format. So we can maybe just walk through these kind of a section at a time and just see if you have any comments or questions for me.
Sure. I have a quick question about the housing goals number 9 that's had the strike through.
Mhm.
So adopt standards to protect stream corridors and wetlands and to encourage density transfer in low density residential areas. We recently made some changes to our code regarding stream corridors, et cetera. Did this have a strike through in it? Was this struck out because of its specificity on low density residential?
Well, and because you did it, basically,
Okay.
because it was something that was essentially an action, but it was also an action that you'd already undertaken. So as you said, you guys did go through and update your code, and you did adopt standards to protect stream corridors and wetlands, and encourage or allow for density transfer. So we felt like, oh, okay, that one's been done. It was in there, you did it. And we don't need to continue to have it in the comp plan now that it's been done.
Okay.
And kind of same thing with number 2, you know, because it says establish areas in the community where these things are going to be allowed. And again, you've already done that through your zoning code. So we took that one out as well.
And Matt, this is Josh. This would be an opportunity for our board members here to maybe suggest or add policies that we would want to include in the comprehensive plan if there's anything that you feel may have missed.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, so what we've got on the screen now are the more kind of overarching goals. And then there's more specific policies. And then after that, there's the implementation action. So yeah, if you think, you know, there's some kind of broader goals that aren't addressed in this set of goals, we can talk about adding those. And we don't have to agree on the exact language today, but if you think, oh, you know, here's a general goal that we ought to be trying to achieve as a city that I don't see here, we can talk about that. And then we could come up with some language for you as part of the next draft.
Yes, I have a question on number 7. You encourage affordable home ownership, but you kind of seem to do that exclusion of maybe bigger apartment buildings. Is that intentional?
Yeah, so this is not necessarily. This is existing language. We didn't make any changes to this, but it's talking about encouraging affordable home ownership opportunities, and it does include multiple family condominiums, which essentially would be, you could think of that as apartment buildings, but with the ability to own the unit. So I think that it does include it. I don't know if it's the best wording, but I think it attempts to sort of include all of the different types of homes that somebody could own.
And I guess I missed the home ownership part, which is what we're going to try next. But what about apartment buildings? There's a need there as well. Was that did I miss that earlier?
Yeah, and I would say, you know, there are a couple of goals here that just generally talk about meeting a broad range of needs. So, and I'm looking to see if there's something that sort of specifically talks about rental housing.
10.
So yeah, number 10. So number 10 says continue to provide opportunities for a full range of rental housing. We didn't specify specific types, but so we've got both a kind of a goal that talks about encouraging home ownership opportunities, because that's important for people and kind of building household wealth, but then also recognizing the need that not everybody either wants to own a home or can afford to own a home or is in a stage of life where it makes sense. So we've got goal 10 that talks about, you know, providing for a full range of rental opportunities as well. And then the first one's sort of even broader than that, you know, talks about an adequate supply of safe, healthy, affordable housing for all members of the community and kind of recognizes everybody's diverse needs and desires. So.
Does anyone have any further comments or questions, additions on any of that? No. Okay, let's move on to the policies then.
Policies. Okay. So policies, I'm just going to remind myself about how many there are here. I think there were 26 or 27. We added a few. Yeah, it's probably about 25 policies. So maybe on this set, we can just kind of do them a page at a time or so and just see if you have any comments on any of those. I'll make a couple of notes about these. There's a couple here that we thought were duplicative. I think 2 and 3 is not even kind of exactly a policy. It's more of like a statement about a policy, and that's sort of why that one went away. 2, I think we did think was found somewhere else in here. 6, there was some very specific stuff in here that we tried to sort of revise and recapture in policy 5. So even though it looks like that all went away, it didn't really go away. It kind of got restated in 5, and we tried to update it to be a little more reflective about areas where the city's currently trying to create neighborhood centers, and to describe those a little bit. So that's what I would say about policy 5, which looks a lot like A and B under policy 6 used to look. And then some of these other things we did here were just had to do with like just being consistent with the use of language in terms of starting everything with a verb, or, you know, like in the case of number 10 down there, or again, trying to make things not a one-time action, but a course of action, something that you're going to continue to do over time. So like 8's an example of that. And that's what I would say about some of the changes in this first set. But yeah, any comments or questions on any of those 1 through number 10 there?
Yeah, I have a question. I guess from a broad sense, I understand that we're not getting specific, but throughout this process, like how do you get specific? Like number 10 there, I mean, what would be the next step to?
So a couple of things, I guess I would say. One, there are a few, when we get down to those implementation actions or strategies, there's a few things there that get a little more specific. The other place, though, to get more specific is, so we're going through this process now of updating your housing needs analysis or your housing capacity analysis and the goals and policies in your comp plan and the other information. One of the next things the city will need to do is prepare what's called a housing production strategies document. And that is intended to be a much more specific document that identifies specific strategies and actions that the city can undertake to basically kind of achieve the policy goals that are in the comp plan and to meet the needs for different types of housing that are identified in the housing needs analysis. So it's sort of 2 parts. Like there's a little bit of additional specificity here. And then there's the opportunity in that process. And once the city updates its housing needs analysis, it's got about a year to prepare a housing production strategies document. And Josh can probably tell you kind of more about where the city might be headed on that later, or now. But I believe y'all are like in the process of applying for a grant from the state to help fund that. And then you would get somebody on board to help you with that. And you kind of go through the process of, getting quite a bit more specific about specific strategies. Some of those are going to be, further possible updates to your development code. Some of those might be about partnering with, and there's some language about this in the policies too, but about partnering with local housing agency or affordable or market rate housing developers to see some of these things get built. So there's a lot of, or for coming up with funding mechanisms to help offset the costs of developing housing, certain types of housing. So really good question. Again, kind of a long answer, but that's what I would say about that. Yeah.
Josh, will you just talk about that real quick while it's fresh on our mind?
Yeah, I think actually Matt, he kind of, we're in lockstep. He knows, he kind of knows where we're at. We reached out to him when we were actually putting in for a DLCD grant to do this. So yeah, it's going to be probably starting up late winter, springtime, maybe. I'm not sure when when we're awarded on the grant, if we're awarded on the grant, but in any case, we will be moving forward. And in 2024 on that housing production strategy. And it'll be laid out similar to the board that we have here. It'd be the planning commission, and we'll have an advisory committee on that. So for those advisory committee members that are part of this process now, you'd be encouraged to, if you're interested in being part of the process, we'd love to have you.
Okay, so quick follow-up question on that. So we get a grant, the city gets a grant to do the housing production analysis. What happens then? Or what is that?
Well, a housing production strategy. So as Matt was mentioning, it will go through and it will actually find it'll lay out the process to implement some of these standards these policies that we're putting in place here. A lot of those, to the specificity, a lot of those would be taking a look at our development code to make sure that our development code is in line with this. So it's just this two-step process that the state has actually outlined for us to follow.
Okay. Got
Yeah,
it.
And it's
we-
pretty elaborate. I mean, a housing production strategy to this. I mean, this is a lot of information as it is. And then I would say you take it up a notch when it comes to the housing production strategy side of things.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's true. It lays out, specific actions, kind of who you're partnering with to implement those actions, what the timeline is, what's the relative priority, which types of housing you're kind of addressing the need for within a particular strategy, et cetera. So it's as Josh said, pretty elaborate, pretty detailed kind of document.
So like if someone wanted to suggest that we incentivize multifamily development by looking at the SDC fees, that would be during that process.
Absolutely. That
Okay.
is sort of one of the types of strategies that cities typically look at. Do they want to provide reductions or waivers or deferrals in payment of SDCs to
Right.
encourage specific types of housing? Do you want to apply one of the tax abatement programs that are authorized by the state, again, for certain types of qualifying housing development? So there's sort of different funding measures. And then, as Josh said, different approaches to your code. You want to provide some kind of incentives in the form of additional height or reduced parking or whatever it might be for certain types of housing. There's sort of there's a pretty long list of things that you can take a look at during that process.
Okay.
Next question I have is number 5, encourage the creation of new neighborhood centers. So we have a neighborhood center overlay. Is it an overlay or is it actual zoning type? Okay. If we were to, would we be increasing the amount of, based on the verbiage here, 10th and 12th, Garrison, Kelly, Dry Hollow, Weber, would we be adding new neighborhood center overlays? So I know there's one at Trevitt and 10th.
Yeah, so there's a few, and I think on this one, it's basically it would be encouraging more of these. It would be something that, as it's laid out as a policy, would be something that we should probably consider. I think there's going to be, in what you see in the land that we have available, a lot of the land we have available is on the east side of town. I think it's natural that we're going to see a lot of development on the eastern side of the Dalles. And we think of a neighborhood center. A neighborhood center is a place where you could establish a market, establish a grocery store. So it's just creating these little nodes around, reduces the amount of travel that people are going to the grocery store. East side of town, currently people are driving clear across town to get to, Safeway and Fred Meyer. So is there a way to encourage and having those little centers, in other parts where we are going to start to see some development? I think that's really kind of what this policy lays out.
I think my question is it, how much of a hurdle is it, or is it just very regular process for us to add those neighborhood center overlays onto the existing? I think that's probably all high density zoning.
Over there's it's a mix. I think far east side's low, but
Okay.
yeah, it would be, kind of follow in line with probably a zone change type of process, maybe
Okay.
lesser than a zone change, because you're not really changing the underlying zone. You're just adding something to it, it's probably a similar process to the community facilities overlay that we have, which is that process, which we've seen in past when we've been talking about the power stations that have gone up out by Google.
Mhm.
That's establishing a community facilities overlay. That was through a conditional use process. I'd have to look closer into it. We haven't done one for a while, but it'd be something, a similar land use process.
Okay, would it require the notice that you have to give out to everybody, like the RV park, the measures 60?
No, I don't think it would trigger measure 56 on that. I highly doubt it, because you would basically be adding to the ability of your property, because
Okay.
currently if it's a low density residential zone, if you add a neighborhood center on top of it, that low density could then establish a market. So you're basically adding the amount of uses to the zone itself.
Okay, got it. Okay, cool. That's all the questions I have on that page.
Right. Anybody else on this page? Generally making sense. Okay, so we'll just kind of keep scrolling through these, and just again kind of mention some of the types of changes we suggested. There's a couple of these here where I think so there are some of the types of things I talked about earlier. So I think for 12, the first part of that language we clipped is really already reflected in other policy language. So that was duplicative. And then we just kind of added a, set of verbs there. 13 was really more of like an action. And so I think we moved that to the implementation actions or strategies section. And then 14 is something to do in your code, not so much in policy language. That was why that one came out. Same thing with 16. So those were things that felt to us more like you were kind of veering into the area of including standards in your code. And 20 kind of, so it's kind of the same thing. There's a lot of very specific language in there about specific types of code standards that you would apply to new development. That's really more appropriate to be talked about in your code. But we do think it's important to sort of say, hey, you will use, and this is a state requirement, that you have clear and objective development standards for all areas, all residential areas in the city. So that I think does make sense. Like you want to have sort of that policy framework around that, and it's consistent with what the state says. So, and then a number of these, we didn't make any changes to, or made some more minor changes to.
Does anyone have any questions or thoughts on this page? No? Okay, let's keep moving.
All right. All right. So, yeah, there's a couple here. The one that starts kind of at the top of that page I was just on is really talking about an action that's already been undertaken. And also gets reflected up above in that policy 5 that we talked about. So that's why we struck that one. 25, I'll say that these are sort of identified density ranges for specific comp plan designations, and they're not necessarily reflective of what your zoning code allows. And generally, we don't think you should have a set like a density range in the comp plan policy. It makes more sense for it to be in the code, again, so that you don't set up conflicts between that. And that was the reason for striking that language. And then the duplex development, that doesn't need to be there anymore either, because it's already been reflected in your development code and in the updates to your development code that were adopted as part of complying with House Bill 2001, the middle housing legislation. So that's sort of the rationale around the changes to 25. And And then we added a number of proposed additional policies at the end here that are things we tend to recommend for inclusion in cities' comprehensive plans. So, just talking about using energy efficient building materials and practices and design, construction, remodeling of housing. That's the first XX there. We always like to recommend including language around partnerships because frankly, the reality is the city itself doesn't really build housing. You zone land, you can encourage other folks to build certain types of housing, but you don't build it yourself. So it's just important, we think, to include language about working with, maintaining and expanding partnerships with the folks who are out there building housing. So that's kind of what that one's about. Supporting and affirming the Fair Housing Act is important. It's something you're really required to do, by federal law. And it's something that I will say, DLCD is sort of focusing pretty heavily on kind of fair housing stuff in some of their updated requirements that they're looking at right now. So we generally recommend some language around that. Also regularly monitoring and updating your inventory of buildable land. And then, not just building new housing, but encouraging maintenance and rehabilitation of existing housing stock, and particularly supporting programs that provide money or funds to do that. So those are the new things that we added. And I see Dan has his hand up. So yeah, Dan.
Thank you. Just a question. Are we missing a word under 27, that first sentence?
Could be to ensure.
Just a grammar question.
Yeah, it's an interesting structure.
Oh, I see what you're doing.
Probably we could just get rid of the two. I think maybe there's
Sure,
a lot of complaints have that structure where everything starts with a two, and there's still a couple of those sort of scattered around in here. But mostly we tried to start things with a verb. So I would suggest there and up in 25 we start it with a verb. Yeah, because to me it's kind of confusing, especially if it's just once in a while you see it.
Yeah, I get it. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So any other comments or questions on this set?
Yeah, I have one. I guess on the XX, it would be 28 about encouraging energy efficient building material. I don't have any problem with that, but I want to point out that the county already does that. There's a state requirement for additional energy measures, and it's like a 2-page document. It's quite involved, and in order to get a building permit, you already have to do that. So that just might be redundant to have it through this process and then have it through the county's process as well.
Yeah, I mean, if it's something the county's already requiring, I think, you make a good point, not necessarily kind of necessary. If just from sort of a community goals standpoint, you want it in there as some policy language, you could keep it in. And then I think, encourage would just mean, you're sort of generally providing either information about the county's requirements, if that's appropriate, or just when you're talking to builders saying, hey, this is a good idea, or pointing them towards other resources related to that. So I think, it's up to you whether we kind of keep this in or don't keep it in if you think it doesn't make sense because it's duplicative.
And I think to that point, Alan, that is a good point. I do think though, if we keep it in, it could be something I'd like to see at some point. Our design standards change in the city. It needs to be updated. Currently, we don't have design standards for the entire industrial zone. There's just, I think when you look at our design standards, they're archaic. And I think this could possibly give the ability as an additional design standard. Maybe it gives us opens up that policy in the future, maybe considering energy efficiency in design as an acceptable design standard. Maybe
no harm in having it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else on these? Do they generally make sense to folks?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna scroll down to the implementation measures. Here, one, we just kind of added some additional, language up front just to sort of describe the nature of implementing measures. Because generally in a comp plan, the policies, like everything's important, but the policies are frankly more important. You are obligated to make decisions that are consistent with policies, with goals and policies in your comp plan. So, when you're reviewing land use decisions, when you're updating your development code, when you're doing those things, you need to be consistent with the policies. Implementation measures are more, these are actions that you want to take if resources and time and other things allow. So frankly, we like to include some qualifying language around that. And so that's sort of what that language up front does, is just provide some qualifiers to sort of distinguish implementation measures from goals and policies. So we did that. For some of these things under the first two sections, we took a look at those. And they, again, seem to fall into that category of things that are essentially code standards, or directing you to make very specific changes to your code standards, many of which either have already been undertaken, or they're not necessarily consistent with actions that you have undertaken, because they were prepared a long time ago. So a lot of those, we just said, you probably don't want to include those for those reasons. So we struck a bunch of stuff out of this implementation measures section. And then we added a number of things that are based, that either came from the policies, where we kind of moved things over from the policies, where that language we thought was more specific and should be in implementation measures, or we added some language that came from, so when your housing needs analysis was last updated, one of the things that was done as part of that process was to prepare a housing strategies report. And that housing strategies report includes a number of specific types of strategies, and that was adopted at that time. We didn't go back as part of this process and reinvent the wheel on that, or kind of look at all that stuff, but that was part of that previous HNA. And you will be again going through this housing production strategy process, but we don't want to lose all that stuff from the previous iteration of the housing needs analysis. So we incorporated a number of things that were described and discussed in that previous housing strategy report into this section. And again, that's sort of why we added those caveats up above too, because we thought, hey, we don't want to lose this. These are some of those more specific things that we talked about earlier that you can investigate or work on, and that could be the basis for some of what you do in that housing production strategy process. So that's my kind of long explanation or preface to where some of this stuff came from that we added into this section. So I won't walk through them all in detail, but that's the source of them. So again, happy to answer questions, or if there's any you think are not appropriate, let us know, but they kind of came from that earlier work that was done for the city.
Quick question. I'm sorry if this seems elementary, given how far we're into this right now.
Yeah.
So we're looking at comprehensive plan amendments.
Yes.
Goal 10. Excuse me. We have section 10, goals, then policies, and then implementing measures. Do all, I know this seems silly, but do all three of those things, goals, policies, and implementing measures, go into section 10? Or is it just goals and policies, and implementing measures is how we put it in?
The as kind of this is written and intended, these implementation measures or implementing measures, they would also go into that section of your comp plan. And again, that's kind of why we put that caveat language up front to distinguish these from the goals and policies, to say, hey, the goals and policies, sort of Oregon law says you need to act consistently with those. But by describing these implementation measures as a menu of things that you may do, resources, depending on resources, time, available partnerships, et cetera. We kind of get this stuff in there, but it's not as binding, frankly, as the policies.
Okay, yeah, I think that was my,
But yeah, it is intended to go into that section of the comp plan.
okay. But not as binding as the goals and policies.
Correct.
These are kind of more suggestions.
Yes, I would say that. Now, to the extent that some of these things wind up in your housing production strategy, they will be more binding because the state is in the process. There are already some administrative rules around what goes into a housing production strategy, and the state is in the process of writing additional rules that sort of talk about how sort of what the city's obligations are to implement the things in a housing production strategy, and what the process is for some state oversight and monitoring of those things. So when you get into that process, you are going to want to think, closely about the things that go in there and what you say you're committing yourselves to do, because you'll either need to do them or you'll need to say, hey, here's why we couldn't do this thing during this period of time. So that's important. But in terms of this section of your comp plan, not quite the same thing.
Okay, got it.
What I just
And
described.
the reason I ask is because, I'm looking at something like item 6, review the city system development charges and other fees, consider implementing tiered fees based on home size and affordability targets. Or item 11, encourage development of affordable housing when opportunities arise to redevelop publicly owned properties.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want us as a planning commission or the plan department, whatever that future may be, to be trapped in these situations where, so as long as these are just suggestions and not things that we are bound to,
And I think
that's my concern.
the way, yeah, and I think that's the way we've tried to write them with the kind of the intro text. And we also, frankly, we tried to use verbs here that are a little less committal or a little more non-committal. So, that one you mentioned, 6, it says, review the city system development charges. So, take a look at them. That doesn't take a huge amount of time to take a look. But then it says, and other fees, and consider implementing tiered fees based on. So the consider means think about it, assess it. Is it a good idea? If so, do it. But it doesn't say just go out and do it, for sure. And so I think that we did try to write some of these policies with language that kind of gives you the ability to take a look at something, decide if it's a good idea, and then do it. And I think, again, you're going to want to kind of think about how you frame things when you get to your housing production strategies process as well. But we tried to not make these things in this section, in the implementation measure section, things that you are automatically on the hook, have to do these things.
Okay.
So hopefully that helps. And,
Josh, do you get what I'm saying? Do you get my question? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, you're not trying to add to my workload, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
good way to.
Okay. Dan, you have a question?
Would it be possible to include a reference to land trusts under item 10?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that is something I think we talked about in that housing strategies document that I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
In all seriousness, though, I think on number 6, I think that is something that I think the city of Newport successfully completed an SDC methodology just a few years ago. I want to say 2017, and it's based off of square footage. And in that, they've seen of smaller developments occurring instead of these, larger houses that we typically see, large single family homes that get built.
Mhm.
So I think by doing something fees based off of SDCs, based off of a tiered or square footage, it's actually quite beneficial to add more housing rather than something that's charged. A 3,000 square foot house is charged the same as a 600 square foot single family home, So just a side note on that. I wouldn't mind taking that on at some point.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would echo that.
I'll chime in on that when you're ready. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also just note that in addition to Newport, city of Prineville did a similar thing, and the city of Albany did the same thing as well. And the city of Albany pretty recently, just within the last year, they updated their SDC methodology. And it, frankly, it's kind of in keeping with the whole point. SDCs are supposed to be applied to kind of address the impact of new housing or growth on the use of and treatment of water, wastewater, et cetera. And, you know, less square footage typically means less bathrooms, which typically means less use of those things. So, yeah, I would echo the stuff that Josh said. I'm sorry to interrupt there. And yeah, somebody had another comment on that too, I think.
Did you want to chime in, Alan, or?
No, I was just, we're staying with non-specific things at this point. So
Does anyone else have any questions regarding this page, implementing measures, etc.? Okay. Let's keep moving on.
All right, so there's just a few more. This is the last page in this part of the document. So yeah, just 3 other implementation measures. You know, they sort of talk about looking at some potential barriers to specific types of housing. Single room occupancy is one of them. You know, looking at number 13 is something that if some cities, you know, think or you know, determine this as an issue or a problem, and pursue ways to address it, and others don't, you know. So it really depends on the city. It's about short-term rental housing, and, you know, does it have an impact on the cost or availability of long-term rental housing? And so when we kind of write this language or recommend a city think about doing this, first of all, they have to sort of say, hey, we think there's a problem. B, they have to do some evaluation of, is it a problem? You know, how many units are we talking about? Do we think that is having an impact on the supply of other types of housing or the cost of that housing? And then if so, do we want to do something about that? So, you know, I think that tends to be a kind of a stepwise approach to addressing that. And then the last one is just talking about working with some of your local housing providers to address houselessness and the impacts of that in the Dalles. So those are all things that were identified in some way, either as part of that earlier housing strategies report or through discussion with staff as part of this this process.
And Matt, I would add, if we can put on 14, if we can also add the Mid-Columbia Community Action Council.
That myself.
And it does have, and other local organizations. So, okay, so if new ones show up, or if we miss any, it'll still be captured by that.
General enough. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to jump back way back into the packet because I have a question. The word houselessness reminded me of this. On page 15 of the housing needs analysis, I think we talked about this last time, and I apologize. At one point in time, count of homeless individuals in Wasco County conducted in January of 2022 found 194 homeless individuals on the streets and shelters or other temporary and/or precarious housing. This is a 73% increase over the prior count. When was that prior count? And is that percent increase similar to what's happening in the state or local level?
That is a good question. I don't know that I know the answer to that question. What can just define the
Don't point in time
Page
counts happen every.
26 of the total packet.
Here, Cornet.
Yeah, 26 of the total packet and
Got it.
page
There we-
15, the other
Yeah.
is.
found it.
Chair Cornet,
Yes.
I can weigh in if that's helpful.
Yeah, if you could. Sorry,
Sure.
Matt.
No, no worries.
So I understand that refers to the number of homeless individuals in the jurisdiction is referenced by an acronym called a PIT count. PIT stands for point in time count. It is a nationally recognized by the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department as a standard method of counting people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. It takes place on the same night every year in January. And so I imagine that if your first question, which was, well, when was the previous count? I imagine it was the same night in January 1 year ago for the results that you're looking at there.
Okay.
With respect to whether that increase is consistent with the numbers found in other jurisdictions throughout the state, I do not know the answer to that question.
Okay.
And if I could put it, I used to attend some meetings about that, and I know there was the way they count doesn't match how homeless are in our area. They count like in those shelters and that kind of, we don't have those. So I know there was definitely, we thought we were under counting before, and I'm talking like 10 or 20 years ago. So maybe they just came up with a different method of counting, could easily be the difference. Just from what I know, that it was a problem 15 years ago when I used to attend meetings.
Yeah, there was a huge shift in the way outreach was performed
There you
for
go.
the
Yeah.
time count this year.
Huh.
They partnered with a number of different organizations that hadn't happened previously, and there were like a huge number of bilingual individuals that were part of the outreach team that had not been included in previous years
Got
also.
it. Okay.
So there was definitely better outreach done for that PIT count this year than had been done in previous years. So there was definitely an under count previously.
Okay. Got it. Okay. That answers that question. I apologize for the detour for a question that I should have asked last time.
I
No
have one
worries.
question, the page before that. Okay.
Sure.
So you have in the chart, figure 2.8 on 25 of 57, that there's 693 subsidized units in the Dalles. And where did you come up with that number? Whoever came up with that?
So the source of the information was the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department. And they would have likely sort of gotten at least some of that information. I think they kind of maintain information about the number of subsidized units in counties across the state, cities and counties across the state. I don't know exactly where they're pulling their data from, if it's coming from local housing authorities or others, or if they have some other source of that information. But that's the source, at least, that we cited. So yeah, I'm not sure beyond that. That's something we could check in with the folks at Johnson Economics who help with
I think if you would, because I know we have a chart. I mean, it's now probably 10 years old, but I don't think there's been hardly any subsidized housing built since. And it has like about 9-10 units that probably total 200 apartments, maybe 3. So I just wonder, I know in the past I've noticed there's been a big number in the county, and a lot of that was any orchardist who got help to build the housing for their pickers was included because they got some grant from Oregon. But that number hardly went up, and I can't imagine there's only 9 or 11 subsidized units in the county compared to the Dalles. So I think those numbers are, if I doubt there's 693 year-round apartments or subsidized housing in the Dalles. I may be off base, but I know we don't have that. We only have maybe somewhere over 100, but not too terribly far over 100. And I know there's some other places that have apartments, but there's a couple big ones over by Kmart, but there's not that many. You know, there's one down by the senior center. There's, you start adding them up and they're 20 to 50 each, but it doesn't get you to almost 700 very quickly.
Yeah.
And then one last comment on the figure 3.6, the comparison, or no, excuse me, further down. It looks like that chart.
Kind of the data.
The one that
around-
compared the available units to their income. It was an orange and red chart. I had it in my head. Where'd it go? It's after the one page, so.
6, page 31 of the packet, page 20 of the housing needs analysis.
Yeah, so it shows an overabundance of apartments at the $25,000 to $35,000 range, like almost double apartments available that are needed. I doubt that's accurate as well. The Housing Authority did do a study for increasing their payment standard, and it was finished within the last year, probably last 7 months. We actually raised the payment standard, which is sort of the standard rent that is charged in the area. And a 2-bedroom is I just got it texted at 1748. So you figure that does include utilities. So maybe almost 1,700 though is the rent for a 2-bedroom in the Dalles. I doubt that's affordable to someone at 25,000. And so I don't think there's very many apartments. I don't, maybe I can get somebody, I'll send that report to Josh and he can forward it to whoever, but I don't know exactly what data it collected. But I know HUD was way behind on the amounts of the cost of rental in the Dalles. We increased it at $200 or $300 or $400 when we got that increase because the HUD was so far behind on what they thought rents were.
Okay, yeah, please do send that along to Josh and he can forward it to us and
Okay.
kind of let you know where that data is coming from that's in here. And if you've got some additional data that'll help us kind of provide more context or
Right.
if that's more accurate, I think, we're happy to cite it. Yeah. I haven't actually found the chart yet, but
Yeah,
But
3.6
3.6. Okay, so it's a
on page 20 of the report or 31 of the packet.
There it is. I see it. Yep. Cool. Okay, got it. 31. Yeah.
I just picked that range in particular, but I don't know how that report's presented. It may not be information you can directly change this other chart, but it just seems like it's maybe overestimating the affordable units at different prices, at different income levels.
Okay.
Thanks for that, David. And quick question, just for the record, so we all know, what organization do you work with?
I work with the Housing Authority and Columbia Cascade Housing both. I'm technically hired by the Housing Authority, but we contract out to provide all the manpower for the Columbia Cascade Housing Corp.
Got it. Okay.
Both of those agencies.
Okay. Very nice. Okay.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm just going to just sort of note one more thing, just on the topic of data and particularly data around houselessness or homelessness. The housing production strategy process that we talked about, one of the components of that is to prepare what's called a contextualized housing needs assessment. And that document, that process tends to sort of pull recent information from this document, the housing needs analysis, but then add to it and supplement it. And one of the types of information that we or others who work on those types of projects tend to supplement is data related to homelessness. And so there are other sources of information related to that besides just the point in time counts that, when you go through that process that you can get and kind of pull in and add some more context for a little more depth to some of that data. And also just information around needs of specific groups or populations, people with disabilities, people with lower incomes, et cetera. So I just want to note that like this document pulls in a lot of data, but that process will kind of add to it. So just a note on that, and sorry to interrupt there.
No, that's great. I think we can jump back to where we're supposed to be. And if anyone has any questions about that last page of implementation measures, but if not, I think we can begin to wrap up.
All right. So I really didn't have much more to talk to you about tonight. The only thing I had left in the presentation was just next steps. And I'm not even going to bother sort of putting that slide back up there because there was just like 3 things on it in terms of next steps. First one is for us to make some changes to these documents based on what we heard from you at these meetings. So there will be a few things that we'll want to tweak. And then the next step after that will be to have that work session with the city council. So we kind of bring them up to speed. They get to see this information. We talked to them about some of the comments we heard from you all. And then we would then, following that, conduct public hearings with the Planning Commission and with the council to adopt these documents, basically adopt the comprehensive plan amendments and adopt the housing needs analysis report as a supporting document or an implementing document to your comp plan. So those are the next steps. Along the way in there, the city also needs to send copy of these reports, they can be drafts, to the state, to the Department of Land Conservation and Development. That happens 35 days before the first public hearing. So that's kind of an interim step. So they look at these things. When that happens, I'll say that also there's some statewide kind of housing advocacy groups that tend to look at this stuff as well. So you might get comments from them when you do that. So I just kind of put that out there. So you're kind of expecting it. But those are the next steps. And that's pretty much all I had for tonight. But I would also just say, if you do have any additional comments that you didn't have a chance to voice tonight, or, you're looking at these some more later in the week or next week, and you have some comments, please do, or other information, please do send that to Josh and he can forward that on to us. And if there's any other kind of tweaks we can make or need to make, then we're happy to do that. So, yeah. So that's it for me.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Next, staff comments, project updates.
Yeah, so a couple of things, keeping with this housing thing we have. I'm excited to announce that the Urban Renewal Agency on Tuesday successfully funded probably one of the largest housing developments we've seen in a very long time. This is the development that we've talked about, 5-story complex downtown, 108 units. So it's going to take a big chunk out of that, those units that we need over the next 20 years. It's still a little bit of a process that we'll go through. That's really the funding aspect of it. So it's going to be a couple of years that, putting a project like that together, there's a lot that goes into it, but I'm just excited for our board was, ecstatic about it. And nice to see this moving forward. And yeah, more to come on that, but I'm sure it will be coming to a planning commission meeting near you, or at least an update.
Is this the one across the street from Ace Hardware?
It is. Yep. Yeah. So this is the first process in it, really securing that funding. You can imagine it's a pretty expensive building. So there's a more of a formal press release that'll be going out tomorrow, right? I think, Dan. All right. Tomorrow there'll be a formal press release going out with more details on that, but I just wanted to maybe give you a spoiler before it hits the newspaper.
Actually, went out the end of today, right before 5 o'clock, Josh.
All right. Thanks, Dan. We do have a meeting scheduled for September 7th. So keep it on your radar. We will need a quorum for that meeting. Moving ahead, looking at the RV, we're looking at the RV park again. We're probably going to talk about that coming up in maybe October, booting it a little bit, probably sometime in October. There's some.
Is this RV regulations for RV parks?
It is.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
This is the one that we decided to table for the time being, so we
Exactly.
can get to the housing needs analysis stuff. And
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. To the point, we touched on short-term rentals earlier in this conversation. We will, at the city council level, be taking a look at short-term rentals. As you may know, anyone that was on the board just a few years ago, we removed bed and breakfasts from the land use side of things, and it's our Title 8. So it's basically everything in Title 8. It doesn't go to planning commission. It's not a land use process, but we are going to be taking a look at short-term rentals. Possibly modifying making some changes to the code that's currently there. Couple things there is, if you haven't been out to Lone Pine for a while, Lone Pine it's developing quick, and Lone Pine, the subdivision portion of it, the single family home portion of it is really filling up, and there's some new development on some vacant lots out there that are coming down the pipeline as well. One of them is another large. It's actually I'm thinking it's around 60 unit complex out there. So and then, to touch on, we talked about the comprehensive plan. I haven't provided this as an update, but I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Dallas Municipal Code available online. It's pretty easy to search our code online. Well, we've done that exact format, but with the comprehensive plan. So that was added to our website maybe about 2 months ago. So if you want to look back on anything that we discussed this evening to see how it currently looks, feel free, check it out. It's easy to search. It's a really nice format that we have now. So, as as Matt and CJ alluded to, or have shown, we're updating this comp plan. A lot of these standards from 2006, when we went through a process back then, but there's other portions of our comprehensive plan that are a bit older even. So I can imagine, we'll be seeing some updates to the comp plan and, in years to come. So with that, I am more than happy answering any questions.
I don't think we have any questions.
All right.
We'll move on to commissioner comments or questions there as well. I do have one quick comment. This is actually Parks and Rec stuff. I stopped by this just has to do with city progress and things moving forward. Stopped by the Parks office today and talked to the admin there. Nice young lady. That new section of the skate park is well underway. All that, including the pump track, will be done, she says, by the end of October. The mountain bike skills advancement training course, whatever, that's actually done now. You can ride it, which is cool. They're working, going to be finishing up Cirrhosis, which has been taking up a big chunk of their time. But this fiscal year, it seems like they've really started doing some more stuff, which is awesome. So I just think that's great. Yeah. That's it. Anyone else? Nope. All right. Excellent. Well, thank you all. Meeting adjourned. See you next time.